I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
Pearl Harbor is a U.S. naval base near Honolulu, Hawaii, that was the scene of a devastating surprise attack by Japanese forces on December 7, 1941. Just before 8 a.m. on that Sunday morning, hundreds of Japanese fighter planes descended on the base, where they managed to destroy or damage nearly 20 American naval vessels and over 300 airplanes. More than 2,400 Americans died in the attack, including civilians. Another 1,000 people were wounded. The day after the attack, President FDR asked Congress to declare war on Japan. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise, but Japan and the United States had been edging towards combat for years because of the ongoing war in Europe. The United States was particularly unhappy with Japan's increasingly belligerent attitude towards China. The Japanese government believed that the only way to solve its economic and demographic problems was to expand into its neighbor's territory and take over its import market. As a result of that belief, Japan declared war on China in 1937. American officials responded to this aggression with a battery of economic sanctions and trade dealings. Their reasoning was that without access to money and goods, and especially essential supplies like oil, Japan would have to rein in its expansionism. However, the sanctions just made the Japanese more determined to stand their ground. During months of negotiations between Tokyo and Washington, D.C., neither side would budge. It seemed that war was inevitable. The Japanese plan was simple: destroy the Pacific Fleet. That way, the Americans would not be able to fight back as Japan's armed forces spread across the South Pacific. On December 7th, after months of planning and practice, the Japanese launched their attack. At about 8 a.m., Japanese warplanes filled the sky over Pearl Harbor. Bombs and bullets rained into the vessels moored below. At 8:10, an 1,800-pound bomb smashed through the deck of the battleship USS Arizona and landed in her forward ammunition magazine. The ship exploded and sank with more than 1,000 men trapped inside. Next, torpedoes pierced the shell of the battleship USS Oklahoma. With 400 sailors aboard, the Oklahoma lost her balance, rolled onto her side, and slipped underwater. Less than 2 hours later, the surprise attack was over, and every battleship in Pearl Harbor, the USS Arizona, the USS Oklahoma, the USS California, the USS West Virginia, the USS Utah, the USS Maryland, the USS Pennsylvania, the USS Tennessee, and the USS Nevada had sustained significant damage. The only two beyond repair were the USS Arizona and the USS Utah. The others were eventually fixed and put back into use. In comparison, Japan suffered relatively light casualties, it only lost 29 aircraft and a few mini-submarines. However, the Japanese had failed to cripple the Pacific Fleet. By the 1940s, battleships were no longer the most important naval vessel. Aircraft carriers were, and as it happened, all of the Pacific Fleet's carriers were away from the base on December 7th. Moreover, the Pearl Harbor assault had left the base's most vital onshore facilities, oil storage depots, repair shops, shipyards, and submarine docks intact. As a result, the U.S. Navy was able to rebound relatively quickly from the attack. President FDR addressed a joint session of the U.S. Congress on December 8th, the day after the crushing attack on Pearl Harbor. He famously said, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." He then said, "No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. I believe I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make very certain that this form of treachery shall never endanger us again." After the attack on Pearl Harbor, for the first time throughout years of discussion and debate, the American people were united in their determination to go to war. On December 8th, Congress approved Roosevelt's declaration of war on Japan. 3 days later, Japan's allies, Germany and Italy, also declared war against the United States. For the second time, Congress reciprocated, declaring war on the European powers. More than 2 years after the start of World War II, the United States had entered the conflict. The Japanese had wanted to scare the United States into an agreement to lift the economic sanctions against them, yet instead, they had pushed their adversary into a global conflict that ultimately resulted in Japan's first occupation by a foreign power. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Americans realized that if they just stayed passive, they would continue to be attacked, and therefore they needed to fight back. Americans took major offense to the attack made on their country, and by the next day, the American people were in full support of the declaration of war on Japan and the Axis powers.